Evelyn had learned to live in the spaces between things. She existed in the quiet hum of the refrigerator, in the gentle click of a closing door, in the half-murmurs of conversations that paused when she entered a room. For 50 years, she had been the silent scaffolding that held her husband's family together. She was Arthur's second wife, a quiet woman he had married after a whirlwind romance that had scandalized his grown sons, Marcus and Julian. They had never seen her as anything more than a placeholder, a glorified housekeeper who had somehow secured a permanent position. She had raised them, in a way, not from boyhood, but from the raw, angry grief of their mother's passing. She had cooked their favorite meals, laundered their clothes when they came home from college, and listened to their endless complaints about their father, always with a patient, non-committal nod. She had been their constant, their backdrop, the unchanging wallpaper of their lives. Arthur, a man who loved peace more than he loved confrontation, had always been grateful for her quiet presence. He called her his anchor. She often felt more like a ghost. Sections. Now Arthur was gone. The long illness had whittled him down to a whisper, a faint echo of the robust man she had married. She had cared for him until the very end, holding his hand as his breathing grew shallow and finally ceased altogether. The house, a sprawling colonial filled with the ghosts of their shared life, fell silent. It was a silence she had long been accustomed to, but this time it felt different. It felt like a verdict. Sections. The day of the will reading was cold and unnaturally bright. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the lawyer's office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Evelyn sat on a stiff leather chair, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore a simple black dress, the one she had worn to the funeral. Marcus and Julian sat opposite her, flanking Marcus's wife, Claire. They were a united front of tailored suits and expensive perfume. Their grief, if it existed, was well hidden beneath layers of entitlement. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, cleared his throat. He was a man who seemed permanently apologetic, as if he were delivering bad news even when he was not. He read through the preamble, his voice a dry monotone. Evelyn's mind drifted. She thought of the rose garden she had planted, the way the morning light hit the crystal vase on the mantelpiece, the worn spot on the armchair where Arthur used to sit. These were the things that made up her life. Then the words began to cut through the haze. To my sons, Marcus and Julian Ashworth, I bequeath my entire estate, including the primary residence at 12 Elm Street, all financial accounts, investment portfolios, and personal effects contained therein, to be divided equally between them. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. A quiet ringing started in her ears. She looked at Marcus and Julian. There was no surprise on their faces, only a cool, triumphant satisfaction. Claire shot a look at Evelyn, a flicker of a smirk playing on her lips. It was a look that said, "Of course. What did you expect?" She was erased. She was eliminated. 50 years of her life, of her devotion, had been relegated to a footnote, not even worthy of mention. She had been the home's keeper, its heart, and now she was being evicted from its memory. Mr. Sterling coughed, a small, nervous sound. "There is one further item," he said, looking down at the document as if he were ashamed of it. To my wife, Evelyn Ashworth, I bequeath the property listed as Lot 7, Whisperwood Hollow, including the barn structure and all its contents. A beat of silence. Then a choked sound escaped Julian. It was a laugh. He quickly tried to stifle it, turning it into a cough. But the damage was done. Marcus grinned, a cruel, sharp thing. Whisperwood Hollow. Evelyn had never heard of it. A barn. They had left her a barn. Is that some kind of joke? Marcus asked, not bothering to hide his amusement. Father owned a barn? It appears so, Mr. Sterling said, shuffling his papers. He slid a thick manila envelope across the polished table toward Evelyn. This contains the deed and this. From the envelope, he removed a single, ornate brass key. It was heavy, intricate, and utterly out of place amongst the crisp legal documents. It looked ancient, like something from a forgotten fairy tale. It clinked softly as the lawyer placed it on top of the envelope. Claire finally spoke, her voice like ice chips. "A barn. How quaint. I suppose it's more than some people deserve." Her eyes locked on Evelyn, cold and dismissive. The message was clear. "You are nothing. You have nothing." Evelyn said nothing. She reached out a slightly trembling hand and took the envelope. Her fingers closed around the heavy key. It was cold, solid, a tangible piece of an insult. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look at them. She could feel their eyes on her, their smug, victorious stares. She walked out of the office, the heavy key a dead weight in her pocket, the deed to a forgotten barn her only inheritance. The life she had known was over. The humiliation was a physical thing. It settled in her chest, a cold, heavy stone that made it difficult to breathe. When she returned to the house on Elm Street, it was no longer her home. It was already a museum of a life she was being written out of. Marcus and Claire were there, walking through the rooms with a proprietary air, their voices echoing in the sudden emptiness. "This hideous wallpaper will have to go," Claire announced from the dining room, "and the curtains are positively funereal." Evelyn stood in the foyer, invisible. They spoke as if she were not there, a piece of furniture they had not yet decided what to do with. She had chosen that wallpaper with Arthur, a pattern of pale blue hydrangeas. He had loved it. "You have 1 week, Evelyn," Marcus said, turning to her finally. His tone was not unkind, but it was firm, the tone one uses with a departing employee. "To gather your personal belongings. We need to have the estate appraised as soon as possible." Sections. Personal belongings. What exactly did that mean? Was the armchair Arthur's or hers? Was the collection of porcelain birds on the windowsill hers? Or were they part of the house's personal effects? She had purchased them one by one over the years with money from her small housekeeping allowance. She realized with a sickening lurch that she had nothing that was truly her own. Everything was theirs. Sections. The week was a slow, agonizing crawl through the wreckage of her own life. She packed her clothes into 2 suitcases. She gathered her photographs, the faded images of a life spent in service to this family. She found a small box of letters Arthur had written her during their courtship, his handwriting a familiar, comforting scrawl. She packed these things into cardboard boxes, the sound of the packing tape sealing them shut like the final closing of a coffin lid. Marcus and Claire were ever present. They followed her from room to room, their eyes sharp and assessing. When she reached for a small silver music box on her bedside table, a gift from Arthur on their 10th anniversary, Claire's hand shot out. "That's part of the estate," she said, her voice clipped. "It's likely antique." Evelyn froze, her hand hovering over the box. She looked at Claire, at the hard set of her jaw, the unapologetic greed in her eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside Evelyn. The deep, aching sadness began to curdle into a cold, quiet anger. She slowly retracted her hand. She said nothing. She simply turned and continued packing her worn paperbacks. Her silence was a language they did not understand. They took it for weakness, for defeat. They were wrong. Sections. On the final day, a taxi waited for her in the driveway. Her few boxes were stacked by the front door. She took one last walk through the house. The rooms were already being stripped of her presence. The hydrangea wallpaper was peeling back in one corner where Marcus had tested it. Her porcelain birds were gone from the windowsill. She was being methodically erased. She stood in the doorway, looking back at the life she was leaving. Julian was there, leaning against the wall, looking uncomfortable. Of the 2 brothers, he had always been the softer one, but his weakness had always bent in the direction of his brother's will. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Evelyn," he mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "Are you?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. It was the first direct question she had asked any of them since the will reading. He shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the floor. Father's will was specific. She knew it was a lie. They had likely influenced him, worn him down in his final weakened months. Or perhaps Arthur, in his lifelong avoidance of conflict, had simply taken the easiest path, leaving her to face the consequences. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. She did not say goodbye. She simply walked out the door, leaving it open behind her. She did not look back. The taxi drove her away from Elm Street, away from the 50 years of her life that had just been declared null and void. In her purse, her fingers found the cold, hard edges of the brass key. It was all she had left. A key to a ruin. A key to nowhere. The motel room smelled of stale smoke and pine-scented cleaner. The floral bedspread was thin and scratchy, the single window looking out onto a cracked and empty parking lot. This was her new reality. A transient space, anonymous and bleak. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room a crushing weight. The adrenaline that had carried her through the last week had finally drained away, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. She was 78 years old. She had a few $1,000s in a personal savings account, money she had carefully squirreled away over decades. It was not enough. It was not nearly enough. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone, and she was terrified. The despair was a physical entity, a cold fog that seeped into her bones. It whispered to her in the dead of night, "You are old. You are worthless. You have been discarded." She would lie awake for hours, staring at the water-stained ceiling, her mind replaying a lifetime of small slights, of being overlooked, of making herself smaller to accommodate the egos of the men around her. She had thought her devotion was a virtue. She saw it as a fatal flaw. She thought about Arthur. The betrayal of his will felt deeper and more painful than the cruelty of his sons. Had he truly seen her as so disposable? Had his love been so conditional, so easily discarded at the end? The man who called her his anchor had cut the rope and set her adrift in a storm. The bitterness of it was a poison in her throat. For 3 days she barely left the room. She ate crackers and drank tap water. She watched the television without seeing it, the meaningless chatter a flimsy barrier against the roaring silence in her own head. She was at the bottom of a deep, dark well, and she could not see the sky. She contemplated a future of poverty, of depending on the charity of strangers, of fading away in some state-run facility, another nameless, forgotten old woman. The thought filled her with a dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. On the fourth morning, she woke to the sound of rain drumming against the window. She sat up and looked at her reflection in the dark television screen. She saw a frail, frightened old woman with haunted eyes. She saw a victim, and the anger that had flickered to life in the face of Claire's greed roared into a fire. No, she would not be a victim. She had been wronged, yes, she had been betrayed, but she was not finished. She had survived 50 years in the Ashworth family. She had survived the condescension, the invisibility, the quiet dismissals. She was stronger than they knew. She was stronger than she herself had known. She got out of bed, her movements no longer slow and defeated, but deliberate. She took a shower, letting the hot water wash away the grime of the motel room and the clinging film of despair. She dressed in her cleanest clothes. She opened the manila envelope and spread the contents on the small, rickety table. Sections. The deed to Lot 7, Whisperwood Hollow. The address was rural, a series of county roads and post office boxes. She found an old road atlas in the motel's lobby and traced the route with her finger. It was a long way away, a tiny speck in a vast green expanse of forest. It was the end of the world. Or perhaps, she thought, the beginning of a new one. And then there was the key. She picked it up, the brass warm now from the ambient heat of the room. She studied it closely for the first time. It was not just a key, it was a work of art. The bow was shaped like a coiled serpent, its scales intricately detailed. The shaft was fluted, and the bit was a complex maze of wards and teeth. This was not a key for a simple barn door. This was a key to something important. Arthur had been a man of secrets and subtleties. He was a master of the unspoken gesture, the hidden meaning. He avoided direct confrontation, but he was not a simple man. He had been a horologist by hobby, a lover of complex mechanisms, of gears and springs, working in secret harmony to produce a simple result. What if the will was not an insult? What if it was a message, a puzzle? Sections. He had left his greedy, obvious sons the obvious wealth, the house, the money, the things they could see and count. And to her, his quiet, patient wife, he had left a puzzle, a key, a glimmer of something she had not felt in a very long time sparked within her. It was not quite hope, but it was a close cousin. It was curiosity. It was resolve. She would go to Whisperwood Hollow. She would see this barn. She would find the lock that this impossible key was meant to open. She had nothing left to lose, and an entire unknown world to discover. Her dark night of the soul was over. The dawn was breaking, and it was a dawn of her own making. Sections. The journey to Whisperwood Hollow was a journey back in time. She hired a man named Frank, a taciturn fellow with a beat-up pickup truck and kind eyes, to drive her and her few boxes. As they left the manicured suburbs and sprawling highways behind, the landscape began to change. The roads narrowed, winding through rolling hills and dense forests. Pavement gave way to gravel. Cell phone service disappeared. Sections Evelyn watched the world transform through the truck's dusty window. The air grew cleaner, smelling of damp earth and pine. It was a world away from the clipped lawns and sterile perfection of Elm Street. This was a place that was untamed, a place with its own rules. For the first time since leaving the lawyer's office, she felt a sense of release. She was untethered from her old life, a stranger heading into an unknown land. There was fear in that, but there was also a profound and thrilling freedom. Sections. Frank followed the hand-drawn map she had copied from the atlas. They turned onto a road called Hemlock Lane, which was little more than two dirt ruts disappearing into a tunnel of ancient, overarching trees. The light grew dim, dappled in green. It felt like they were entering a cathedral of nature. "This is it," Frank said, his voice low, as if not to disturb the quiet. He pulled the truck to a stop where the lane ended in a wall of overgrown blackberry bushes. "Lot 7. This is Whisperwood Hollow." Evelyn got out of the truck, her legs stiff. She pushed her way through the thorny bushes, which snagged at her coat. And then she saw it, the barn. It was both better and worse than she had imagined. It was huge, far larger than a typical farm barn. The main structure was made of massive hand-cut stones, gray and green with moss, that rose to a height of 30 feet. They looked ancient and immovable, as if they had grown from the earth itself. Above the stone, the wooden upper portion was weathered to a silver gray, the roof sagging in one corner, a few boards missing here and there like lost teeth. The large main doors were boarded over, as were the few windows she could see. Nature was in the process of reclaiming it, with ivy crawling up the stone walls and saplings pushing through the foundation. But it was not a ruin, it was a fortress. It was a sleeping giant. Frank helped her unload her boxes, placing them on a relatively dry patch of ground near the entrance. "You sure you want me to leave you here, ma'am?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "There's not much of anything out here." "I'm sure," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Thank you, Frank." She paid him, and with a final, worried look, he got back in his truck and rumbled away, the sound of his engine slowly fading until it was swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. She was alone, truly, completely alone. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a crow. She walked a slow circle around the barn. It was a magnificent, melancholy structure. On the north side, a smaller, single-story section had been added on, also of stone. It had a sturdy-looking door and a single, grime-covered window. This, she guessed, was meant to be the living quarters. Section she approached the main, boarded-up entrance. With a crowbar she had insisted on buying at a hardware store on the way, she began to pry at the old planks. The wood was soft, the nails rusted. It was hard work, and her muscles, unused to such labor, screamed in protest. But with each creak and groan of the pulling nails, she felt a surge of grim satisfaction. She was not just opening a door, she was tearing down the barriers to her new life. After nearly an hour, she had managed to pull enough boards away to squeeze through. The air that hit her from inside was thick and musty, the smell of old hay, dust, and time itself. She stepped inside, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The interior was cavernous. Beams of dusty light slanted down from holes in the roof, illuminating a vast, empty space. A few pieces of rusted, broken farm equipment lay half-buried in a thick carpet of rotted hay. Cobwebs, thick as cotton candy, draped from the massive wooden rafters high above. It was a place of deep and profound neglect. A wave of her earlier despair washed over her. What had she been thinking? This was madness. An old woman, alone in a derelict barn in the middle of nowhere. It was a pathetic end to a pathetic life. She sank down onto an old wooden crate, the dust puffing up around her. She was about to give in to the tears that were burning behind her eyes when her hand, resting in her coat pocket, brushed against the cold, hard shape of the brass key. The puzzle. Arthur's puzzle. She stood up, her resolve returning. This was not the answer. This dusty, empty space was just the lockbox. The treasure was somewhere else. She began to search. She ran her hands along the cold stone walls, feeling for any irregularity, any seam that seemed out of place. The stonework was remarkably fine, the massive blocks fitted together with barely a crack between them. She searched for hours, her hope beginning to dwindle with the fading afternoon light. She examined the floor, stomping on the dusty planks, listening for any hollow sounds. Nothing. She moved to the smaller attached section. The door was locked, but it was a simple, modern lock. One well-aimed blow with the crowbar, and it burst open. This room was a small, self-contained apartment. A tiny kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a single room with a cot. It was filthy, covered in a thick layer of dust and mouse droppings, but it was plumbed and wired. It was a foothold. Exhausted, she was ready to give up for the day. She returned to the main barn, her eyes scanning the walls one last time. Her gaze fell upon a section of the north wall, near the floor. It was the same wall that the apartment was built against. Something was different about it. The pattern of the moss was interrupted. A large, flat stone, about 3 feet square, seemed to have less growth on it than the stones around it. Her heart began to beat faster. She knelt down, her old knees protesting. She ran her fingers along the edge of the stone. And there, tucked into the seam, almost completely obscured by dirt and grit, was a small, dark hole. A keyhole. It was faced in brass, tarnished to a dark brown that blended perfectly with the stone. With trembling hands, she pulled the key from her pocket. She blew the dust from the keyhole and slid the key in. It fit. It slid in with the smooth, satisfying precision of a well-oiled machine. She took a deep breath and turned the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, she heard a faint click from deep within the wall. It was followed by a low, deep grinding sound, the sound of stone on stone, of immense weight being moved by some hidden, powerful mechanism. The large, flat stone in front of her began to recede into the wall, and then swing inward, revealing a dark, square opening and a set of stone steps descending into blackness. A cool, dry air, smelling faintly of machine oil and old paper, wafted up from the darkness. Evelyn stared, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Arthur, the horologist, the lover of secret mechanisms. He had not left her a barn, he had left her a doorway. The darkness below was absolute, a stark contrast to the dusty light of the barn. Fear warred with curiosity. Every instinct told her to stay in the relative safety of the world she knew, but that world had cast her out. The world below was an enigma, a promise whispered by a dead man. Using the flashlight she had bought, another small act of foresight, she pointed its beam down the stairs. The stone steps were clean, unworn, descending into the earth. She took the first step, then another. The stone door, balanced on some impossibly perfect counterweight, swung silently shut behind her, plunging her into total darkness, save for her flashlight's beam. A click echoed in the sudden silence as the lock re-engaged. There was no turning back now. She was inside. The staircase was longer than she expected, turning once upon itself before opening into a vast, subterranean space. She swept the beam of her flashlight across the room and gasped. This was no root cellar. This was a vault, a sanctuary. The room was immense, at least 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, with a high, arched ceiling supported by stone pillars. The air was cool and perfectly dry, the climate controlled by some unseen system, and the room was filled. It was filled with time itself. Lining the walls were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of clocks. Grandfather clocks with polished mahogany cases stood like silent sentinels. Intricate cuckoo clocks from the Black Forest, their carved birds waiting to sing. Delicate porcelain mantel clocks from France. Skeletal clocks with their brass gears and wheels exposed to the air. In the center of the room, on raised platforms, were larger, more complex pieces. Astronomical clocks with dials showing the phases of the moon and the positions of the stars. And beautiful, life-sized automata, a woman playing a flute, a boy writing a letter, all frozen in mid-gesture. Sections. It was a museum, a world-class private museum of horology and mechanical art. It was Arthur's secret passion, a passion she had only ever seen glimpses of, a few treasured pieces he kept in his study. This was his soul, hidden away beneath the earth. As she walked deeper into the room, a low hum started, and panels in the ceiling began to glow with a soft, warm light. A motion sensor. The room came alive. The polished wood gleamed. The brass shone. The painted faces of the clocks seemed to watch her. It was breathtaking. The sheer scale of it, the value of it, was staggering. It was a fortune that dwarfed the one his sons were so proud to have inherited. Sections. In the center of the sanctuary, nestled between two towering astronomical clocks, was a large, handsome oak desk. It was neat and orderly, as if Arthur had just stepped away from it. On its polished surface sat a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. Her name was written on it in his familiar, elegant script. My dearest Evelyn. Her legs felt weak. She sank into the plush leather chair behind the desk, her flashlight clattering to the floor. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. It was many pages long, written on heavy parchment. My dearest Evelyn, it began, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my greatest fear has come to pass. My sons, in their bottomless greed, have cast you out. For this, my love, I am more sorry than words can ever express. It is the result of my greatest failing, my lifelong cowardice in the face of their avarice. Sections. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes as she read. This was not the letter of a man who saw her as disposable. This was the letter of a man who had loved her deeply, but had been trapped by his own flawed nature. I could not confront them in life, the letter continued. They are my blood, and though they have been a disappointment to me, a father's love is a complex and sometimes foolish thing. I knew that any wealth I left you openly, they would have contested. They would have dragged you through courts, bled you dry, and left you with nothing but bitterness. So I chose a different path, a path of secrets, the only language I was ever truly fluent in. He went on to explain everything. He had bought the land in Whisperwood Hollow decades ago, before he had even met her, using a blind trust established by his own father. The barn was a shell, a decoy. Over 30 years, he had secretly excavated and built the sanctuary, moving his collection here piece by piece in the dead of night, telling his family he was on business trips. The barn and the land were legally untouchable, held in a trust that now named her as the sole, unchallengeable beneficiary. The house on Elm Street, the stocks, the bank accounts. I left it all to them as a distraction, he wrote, a pile of shiny objects to occupy the magpies while the true treasure was kept safe for you. This place, Evelyn, this is your fortress. It is your inheritance. It is my life's real work, and it is all yours. Sections. The letter explained the practicalities. The sanctuary had its own generator, its own well, and a sophisticated climate control and security system. It also directed her to a small, hidden safe behind a panel in the desk. The combination, he wrote, with a touch of his old playfulness, is the date we met, a day I have never forgotten. Evelyn's fingers, slick with tears, fumbled with the dial. October 23rd, 68. The safe clicked open. Inside there was no money, no jewels. There were two things. The first was a simple bank book for an account in her name. The balance made her gasp. It was a substantial sum, more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. It was the proceeds from a few select pieces he had sold quietly over the years. Seed money for your new life, the letter explained. The second item was a thick file folder bound in red twine. The label on it read, Ashworth & Sons Logistics, Internal Audit. I must give you a shield as well as a sanctuary, the letter concluded. Our sons are not just greedy, they are foolishly criminal. For years, they have been siphoning money from the family business through fraudulent invoicing and shell corporations. The file contains all the proof. I gathered it not to harm them, but to protect you. Should they ever come looking for more, should they ever trouble you again, this is your weapon. Use it without hesitation. They will understand its power. Live well, my love. Be happy. Forgive my weakness, and know that in the end, all I ever did, I did for you. Your loving husband, Arthur. Evelyn lowered the letter, the pages trembling in her hands. The tears were not of sorrow now, but of a profound, overwhelming vindication. He had not abandoned her. He had saved her. In his own quiet, complex, roundabout way, he had orchestrated her salvation. The barn was not an insult. It was a testament. The key was not a trifle. It was the instrument of her liberation. She sat there for a long time, in the silent, glowing heart of her secret kingdom, surrounded by the quiet ticking of 1,000 clocks. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks finally, completely, dissolved. It was replaced by a feeling she had never known before. It was the feeling of power. The first few weeks were a period of rebirth. Evelyn moved into the small apartment attached to the barn, scrubbing it from top to bottom until it shone. The running water was cold, the electricity sporadic until she learned the quirks of the generator, but it was hers. It was her home. Every morning she would descend the stone steps into the sanctuary. It was her sanctuary in more ways than one. The quiet, orderly beauty of the place soothed her soul. She spent hours just walking among the clocks, running her hands over their polished surfaces, reading the rare books on horology that lined an entire wall. She was not just learning about clocks, she was learning about the man she had been married to for 50 years. She was discovering the depths of his passion, the brilliance of his secret life. The loneliness she had dreaded never came. The silence of Whisperwood Hollow was not the oppressive silence of the motel room. It was a living silence, filled with the sounds of the forest. And she was not entirely alone. Using the funds from the bank account Arthur had left her, she drove the old Jeep she found parked in a hidden garage bay of the barn into the nearest town, a small, sleepy place called Oak Bend. There she met George. He ran the town's only general store, a cluttered, friendly place that smelled of sawdust and coffee. He was a man in his late 60s with a kind, weathered face and a gentle demeanor. When she introduced herself and mentioned she was living out at the old Ashworth property, his eyes lit up with recognition. "The old stone barn?" "I'll be," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "My father used to talk about Arthur Ashworth's father. Said he was a brilliant man, an engineer, built that place himself. Said it was built like a fortress. Haven't seen anyone out that way in 40 years. Sections George became her first friend, her ally in this new world. He didn't ask probing questions. He simply accepted her. He helped her get a post office box, recommended a reliable handyman, and always had a hot cup of coffee ready for her when she came in for supplies. He was the kind stranger, the representative of a community that judged her not on her past or her connections, but on the quiet dignity she carried. Through him, she slowly began to meet other locals, the carpenter, the electrician, the plumber. Sections. With their help, she began the transformation. The money Arthur had left was more than enough. She decided not to touch the value of the collection itself. That was Arthur's legacy. This was her project. She hired the carpenter, a young man named Ben, to restore the barn. "I don't want it to be a barn anymore," she explained, standing with him in the dusty, cavernous space. "I want it to be a home." Ben, a master craftsman who appreciated the old structure's good bones, understood her vision completely. They replaced the sagging roof, letting light flood in through new skylights. They installed huge panes of glass where the old barn doors had been, framing a magnificent view of the forest. They sanded the old wooden floors until they glowed. The vast, empty space was partitioned into a large, open-plan living area, a modern kitchen, and 2 beautiful guest bedrooms. The old stone walls were left exposed, their mossy, ancient beauty contrasting with the clean lines of the new construction. As the barn was transformed, so was Evelyn. The physical labor of cleaning and organizing, the mental work of planning and directing the renovation, it all invigorated her. She shed the timid, invisible shell she had worn for 50 years. Her back straightened. Her voice, once quiet and hesitant, became calm and assured. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a frightened old woman. She saw a capable, resilient woman who was building a new life from the ground up. She was the mistress of Whisperwood Hollow, the keeper of the sanctuary of time. She was home. Months turned into a season, and then another. Autumn painted the woods in fiery colors, and winter blanketed the hollow in a peaceful, pristine white. Evelyn's new life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The barn was no longer a derelict structure, but a stunning, rustic modern home, warm and filled with light. The story of the widow in the woods, who had transformed the old Ashworth ruin, became a piece of local lore in Oak Bend, told with a mixture of respect and awe. Meanwhile, in the city, Marcus and Julian's fortunes were turning. The large inheritance, which had seemed like an infinite resource, proved to be finite after all, especially when subjected to their profligate spending and poor investments. Claire's desire for a new car, a renovated kitchen, and a lavish European vacation drained their accounts faster than they could have imagined. Worse, the family business, now solely under their mismanagement, was floundering. Without Arthur's steady hand and quiet expertise, contracts were lost, and clients grew dissatisfied. The fraudulent schemes they had used for years to supplement their income became riskier and less profitable as their desperation grew. Sections. They began to argue. The united front they had presented in the lawyer's office crumbled under financial pressure. Claire blamed Marcus for his bad investments. Marcus blamed Julian for his laziness, and they both, in their frustration, began to think about Evelyn. It started with a stray comment from a former neighbor. "I heard Evelyn is living somewhere out in the country, doing quite well for herself apparently." Doing well? The idea was absurd. They had left her with nothing but a pile of rocks and rotting wood. But the seed of suspicion was planted. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, did some digging. He was a man who believed in a finite pie. If someone else had a bigger slice, it must have come from his. He discovered that the property taxes on the Whisperwood Hollow lot were not just paid, but had been prepaid for the next 5 years. And they had been paid from an account he had no knowledge of. "She's hiding something," he declared to Julian one evening, his voice tight with anger and suspicion. "Father must have hidden money away for her. That barn, it was a trick." "What could be there?" Julian asked, ever the follower. "It's a ruin." "I don't know," Marcus snapped, "but we're going to find out. She's an old woman. Whatever she has, she can't protect it. It belongs to us. It's our birthright." Sections. Their greed, rekindled and sharpened by their own failures, propelled them into action. They didn't call. They didn't warn her. One crisp spring morning, they got into Marcus's expensive sedan and drove out towards Whisperwood Hollow. They were predators, smelling blood in the water. They expected to find a destitute old woman living in squalor, an easy target they could intimidate or trick out of whatever little secret she was hoarding. They were picturing her defeat, her pleas for mercy. Their arrogance was a shield against the reality of their own incompetence. Sections. The journey that had been a revelation for Evelyn was for them an annoyance. The loss of cell service, the winding gravel roads, it was all an inconvenience, a sign of how far they had to travel to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. When they finally turned onto Hemlock Lane, they were met with their first surprise. The road was no longer a pair of muddy ruts. It was a well-maintained gravel drive, the overhanging branches neatly trimmed. They pulled to a stop where the lane opened up, and they stared, dumbfounded. The wall of blackberry bushes was gone, replaced by a gracefully landscaped garden. And the barn, it was not a barn, it was a masterpiece. The ancient stone gleamed in the morning sun. The new glass walls reflected the green of the forest, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from a modern stone chimney. It was a home that radiated wealth, taste, and permanence. It was more beautiful, more impressive than the house on Elm Street they had stolen from her. Sections. They got out of the car, their city shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. The confidence they had carried with them on the drive evaporated, replaced by a confused, resentful silence. This was not what they had expected. This was not the picture of destitution they had painted in their minds. Sections. The front door of the house opened, and Evelyn stepped out onto the stone patio. The transformation was absolute. She was not the stooped, gray, invisible woman they had discarded. She wore simple but elegant wool trousers and a cashmere sweater the color of cream. Her silver hair was beautifully cut, framing a face that was calm and composed. She radiated a quiet, unshakable authority. She looked at them, her two stepsons, not with fear or anger, but with a cool, distant appraisal. "Marcus, Julian," she said, her voice even and smooth. "I can't say I was expecting you." They were stunned into silence. The power dynamic they had always taken for granted had been utterly inverted. They were the intruders here. They were the ones who were out of place. "Evelyn," Marcus finally managed, recovering a fraction of his usual bluster. "What is all this? Where did you get the money for this?" He gestured vaguely at the magnificent house, his hand trembling slightly. "Arthur was a resourceful man," she said simply. She did not invite them in. She stood on her patio, the owner of her domain, and made them stand on the lawn below. The subtle shift in elevation was not lost on them. "This property belongs to the estate," Julian blurted out, parroting a line they had likely rehearsed in the car. "Any improvements, any assets found here, they belong to us." Evelyn allowed a small, knowing smile to touch her lips. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a person holding all the cards. "Is that what you believe?" she asked, her voice soft. "You came all this way because you believe there is more for you to take." Her calm, direct assessment of their greed left them sputtering. They had expected tears, fear, submission. They were met with a woman made of steel and stone, a woman who saw them for exactly what they were. "Come inside," she said finally, her tone shifting. It was not an invitation, it was a summons. "Since you've come all this way, you should see what your father truly left me." She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open. Hesitantly, like chastened schoolboys, they followed her inside. The interior was even more stunning than the exterior. The open space soared up to the exposed rafters, filled with light and art and comfortable, beautiful furniture. Their own house, the one they were so proud of, suddenly seemed gaudy and tasteless in comparison. Evelyn did not offer them a seat. She walked across the glowing hardwood floor to the far stone wall, the one that had once been the exterior of the original barn. They watched her, a growing sense of unease creeping over them. She pressed a small, almost invisible button set into the mortar between two stones. There was a faint click, and then the deep, grinding sound of a hidden mechanism. A large section of the stone wall swung inward, revealing the dark staircase. Marcus and Julian stared, their mouths agape. Their suspicion had been a pale, pathetic imitation of the reality now unfolding before them. "You wanted to see my inheritance," Evelyn said, her voice echoing slightly in the sudden silence. "Very well, after you." She gestured toward the stairs, a queen granting an audience. Driven by a greed that overwhelmed their fear, they stumbled forward and began to descend into the earth, their minds reeling. Evelyn followed them, her steps steady and sure on the familiar stone. The heavy door swung shut behind them, sealing them in the heart of her power. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the motion sensors activated, and the sanctuary flooded with light. The gasp that escaped Julian was sharp and audible. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes wide, scanning the cavernous room. The sheer, incalculable value of the collection hit them like a physical blow. The gleaming wood of the grandfather clocks, the intricate brass of the automata, the sheer number of priceless artifacts. It was a treasure beyond their wildest imaginings. Their father, the quiet, boring man they had always faintly patronized, had been hiding a secret kingdom, and he had given it to her. "My God," Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse. His mind was already calculating, appraising. The resentment on his face was a raw, ugly thing. This is ours. This is part of the estate. You hid this from us." "I hid nothing," Evelyn said calmly. She walked past them, her footsteps silent on the stone floor, and sat behind the large oak desk. She was completely at home here, enthroned in the center of the room. "Your father gave it to me, every last piece. The legal framework is, I assure you, impeccable. The trust that owns this land and everything in it predates your father's marriage to your mother. You have no claim, not a legal one anyway." The implication hung in the air. They might not have a legal claim, but they were two strong men, and she was an old woman. A flicker of that old arrogance returned to Marcus's eyes. He took a step toward the desk. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and menacing. "A court will see this for what it is. Theft." Evelyn did not flinch. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady. "I don't think you want to go to court, Marcus." She reached into a drawer of the desk and pulled out the thick file folder bound in red twine. She placed it on the polished surface between them. "Ashworth and Sons Logistics, Internal Audit." The color drained from Marcus's face. Julian, standing behind him, looked confused for a moment, and then a wave of dawning horror washed over him. "Your father was a meticulous man," Evelyn continued, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "He knew you were stealing from the company. He had been documenting it for years. Fraudulent invoicing, shell corporations, embezzlement. It's all in here. He gathered it not to prosecute you, but to protect me. He knew this day would come. He knew your greed would eventually lead you here." She let the silence stretch, letting the reality of their situation sink in. They were not here to intimidate her. They were trapped. Their blustering, their threats, their lifetime of entitled arrogance. It all collapsed into a pile of ash in the face of this single, damning file. They were ruined. Not just financially, but criminally. She held their futures in her hands. What do you want?" Julian stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time, not as a meek servant, but as a figure of immense and terrifying power. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. She looked from one to the other, her expression unreadable. She felt no desire for revenge, no need to gloat. All she wanted was peace. All she wanted was to be left alone to live the life she had built. "I have here," she said, pulling a set of documents from another drawer, "a simple agreement drawn up by my lawyer. It states that you relinquish any and all future claims, real or imagined, to any part of your father's estate. You will cease all contact with me. You will never set foot on this property again. You will disappear from my life, and I from yours." She pushed the documents and a pen across the desk. "You will sign this," she said, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "In return, this file," she tapped the red folder, "will remain sealed in this vault. Its contents will remain a secret between the three of us and your father's memory. If you refuse, or if you ever trouble me again, a copy will be delivered to the district attorney's office. The choice is yours." It was a checkmate, a perfect, inescapable trap laid by a dead man and executed by the woman they had so foolishly underestimated. Marcus stared at the documents, his jaw clenched. His entire life he had been the one in control, the one who made the demands. To be so thoroughly and completely defeated by this quiet old woman was a humiliation more profound than any financial loss. But he had no choice. She had him, and he knew it. Without a word, he snatched the pen and signed his name, his signature an angry, illegible scrawl. Julian, pale and trembling, did the same. "Now get out," Evelyn said, her voice dropping the last ounce of politeness. "Get out of my home." They turned and walked away, their shoulders slumped in defeat. They didn't look back at the treasure they were leaving behind. They ascended the stairs and disappeared into the world above. Evelyn listened until she heard the sound of their car starting, the engine roaring in frustration before speeding away down the gravel lane. She sat alone in the glowing silence of the sanctuary. She looked at the signed documents, the legal confirmation of her freedom. She looked at the red folder, her shield, and her sword. She had faced her tormentors, and she had won, not with anger or violence, but with quiet strength and the unassailable power of the truth. A deep, profound peace settled over her. The final ghost of her old life had been exorcised. Sections. In the months that followed, the lives of Marcus and Julian continued their downward spiral, a descent now accelerated by the finality of their defeat. Their ill-gotten gains from the main inheritance, which had seemed so vast, were consumed by bad debts and the legal costs of their floundering business. The house on Elm Street, once a symbol of their victory, became a gilded cage, a constant reminder of the true fortune they had lost. They were forced to sell it at a loss, its value diminished by Claire's garish and expensive renovations. Their partnership, built on a foundation of shared greed, dissolved into bitter recriminations. They faded into the obscurity they deserved. Their downfall, not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, pathetic implosion, a direct consequence of the character flaws their father had seen so clearly. Evelyn never heard from them again. Their absence was a quiet, welcome peace. She was free. With her future secure and her past finally laid to rest, she turned her attention to her new purpose. The sanctuary was Arthur's legacy, a monument to his secret passion, but it felt wrong to keep it hidden from the world, a treasure known only to her. Arthur had built it for her protection, but she knew he would have wanted his life's work to be appreciated. She began a new project, working with historians from a nearby university and the local craftsmen from Oak Bend. She started the slow, meticulous process of cataloging the entire collection. She learned the story behind each clock, each automaton. She learned to wind them, to care for them, to keep their delicate hearts beating. Her vision was not for a grand public museum, but for something more intimate, more in keeping with the spirit of the place. She established the Whisperwood Sanctuary of Time, a small private foundation dedicated to the preservation and study of horological arts. It was open by appointment only to students, researchers, and small groups of true enthusiasts. It was not a commercial venture. It was an act of love, a way to share Arthur's gift with the world without sacrificing the peace and seclusion of her home. But her purpose extended beyond the clocks. She had been given a second chance, a fortress of solitude and wealth. She could not, in good conscience, keep it all for herself. She remembered the terror of the motel room, the feeling of being discarded, of having nowhere to go. She knew there were other women like her, women who had been victimized by greedy families, by circumstance, by a world that too often rendered them invisible. Sections. On the other side of her sprawling property, nestled in a quiet grove of birch trees, she began to build again. This time, it was a small, elegant retreat, a collection of 3 beautiful, self-contained cabins, connected by stone pathways to a central communal lodge with a library and a warm, inviting fireplace. It was not a charity in the cold, institutional sense. It was a haven. She called it the Anchor House, in a quiet, forgiving nod to Arthur's long-ago term of endearment. She worked with a network of social workers and legal aid societies to find its residents. They were women of all ages who had been displaced, who had lost their homes, their security, their sense of self. They came to the Anchor House not for a handout, but for a hand up. They could stay for up to a year, free of charge, in a place of safety and beauty, with access to counseling, job training, and the quiet, healing power of the forest. Evelyn was not just their benefactor, she was their mentor, their friend. She shared her story, her quiet strength, her unshakable belief in the power of resilience. A year later, Evelyn's life was fuller and richer than she could ever have imagined. Her days were filled with purpose. Mornings were often spent in the sanctuary, guiding a wide-eyed engineering student through the complexities of a 17th-century astronomical clock. Afternoons were spent at the Anchor House, having tea with the residents, listening to their stories, offering quiet encouragement as they planned their own new beginnings. Her home, the magnificent barn, was often filled with the laughter of her new friends from Oak Bend. With George the carpenter, Ben and his family, and the women from the retreat, all gathered for a communal supper. She was no longer invisible. She was the heart of a thriving, vibrant community she had built herself. She was the matriarch of Whisperwood Hollow, a title bestowed upon her with affection and respect by the people whose lives she had touched. One cool evening, as the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Evelyn walked along the path that led from her home to the Anchor House. The lights were on in the cabins, warm and inviting. She could hear the murmur of conversation, the sound of lives being rebuilt. She paused and looked back at her own home, the great stone and glass structure glowing against the darkening forest. From deep within the earth, she could almost feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of 1,000 ticking hearts, the secret legacy that had given her this new life. She had been given a barn, an insult, a symbol of her dispossession. But she had found the key. She had unlocked not just a hidden fortune, but the hidden strength within herself. Her true worth was never in the 50 years of service she had given to a family that did not value her. It was in her own dignity, her own resilience, her own capacity to take the ruins of one life and build a beautiful, purposeful new one. She was not a ghost in someone else's house. She was the master of her own sanctuary, a beacon of hope in the quiet heart of the woods. And she was, finally and completely, at peace.